underway, and I guess I'll start with two parts to this. One is kind of the genesis of where the whole presentation came from. As you just heard from the introduction, I'm really an engineer and a technical specialist. I do things in reliability, risk, resiliency, and quality. But a few years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, I started doing some presentations, and some people said, you need to do more on the communication side. And when I asked people, I said, no, there's got to be something else you want to hear, something more technical, something about a tool, something that's missing, from a fault tree analysis to a reliability block diagram to a failure modes and effects, something better. And people just came back and said, no, I got the tools. I generally have the tools. I just can't get my bosses to understand. And so I started doing some webinars and some keynotes, and really led to a 4-hour and then an 8-hour workshop that I do. And I work for CH2M, so some of those I do for my clients, but I do a lot of them for professional organizations like ASQ as they do their international and national conferences. So that's kind of where this material came from, and I'll talk about those workshops. The other thing that I'll talk about is, oh, wait a minute, let's see if I can advance. Is about probably last year, I had a few people that I respect really asked me, they said, you need to take the workshop, the 8-hour material, and write it down. And so I did. So this, about a month ago, my new book, Communicating Reliability, Risk, and Resiliency to Decision Makers, was published. And you can probably easily, I'll talk more about it later, but you can get it on Amazon.com, both in print and Kindle versions. But not necessarily a plug for the book, except to say that all the material that I'll try to touch on in an hour today and in an 8-hour workshop, I've got it in the book. So if you want that, it's available out there. I want to bring a situation, get to the end of why this is so important. And because this is the Blue Ridge section, I wanted to bring something out of Virginia and the Carolinas to you. I know that probably half the audience here is not from the Carolinas, but a little home flavor. But let's go back to this past year. It's Friday. It's before Super Bowl Sunday. We're in Chapel Hill, Carrboro, North Carolina, home of the UNC Tar Heels and the major university at UNC hospitals. And I like to use these public examples too, because they're public and I can share them without having any problems with my clients that want things to be confidential. But in this case, very publicly, they had a problem with the water plant. They had too much fluoride in the system. They went to shut down the water plant, and when they did to go to their backup, the backup burst almost immediately. And so what basically happened was we had no water for 24 hours, and we had water restrictions for 3 days. And almost to make it worse, not just the hospital, but almost to make it worse, and I mean this kind of funny and serious, UNC was playing a home basketball game against Notre Dame. And this was right before March Madness, so it was very important. And that game had to be moved to Greensboro, to a neutral court. And I still joke and say a lot of people were lucky that Carolina won that day, or maybe more jobs would have been lost. In this case, no jobs were lost. But so I get a phone call early on Monday morning after things were restored, and they said, JD, we want you to come do the root cause analysis for this. And we want it in 4 days, and we're going to release it straight to the media. We're not going to cleanse it. We're not going to look at it. It's all yours. Just come out and do it. The first part of this example I want to show you is we had a very large team working on this. We had a lot of modeling we did. We had a lot of sampling we did. We had tons of data. But at the end of the day, to communicate this to decision makers, we basically boiled down into about a 6-page document. And people said, JD, you got to have more than this. We got all these model runs. And I said, no, we're going to keep it very simple. And so this is kind of the first kind of example I leave with you of the way that I would say any communication, even on complex problems, needs to be no more detailed than this. When we talk about attachments, because we are technical people want to put all these complex attachments in, and we started with 2. The other thing I do, I like to have 4 to 6 pages at most, sometimes 2 pages, but then my attachments are only a couple. I start with 2 simple ones, and in this case, not a real complicated process diagram, but a real nice, easy kind of schematic block diagram of what's going on so that the decision makers can easily understand it. We came back with a causal factors timeline, which ended up being a very important document. But again, increasing the level of complexity, but still more descriptive than quantitative, so people can kind of follow what's happening. By the time we got toward the end, the detailed attachment became the failure modes and effects analysis. But the psychology was here, this was as much detail as any decision maker, or even the media in this case, we want to see, because we progressively had three documents before that with this one, and then they said, hey, that's enough, I don't want to see anymore. So question answered, validity there for the result, and the media can move on. Now what happened here was this. All over the newspapers, all over the media, we weren't the only consultant that were asked to do the root cause analysis. Another firm was asked to do one for the pipeline. And the punchline for this came out to be, at the end of the day, they did a very great report. In fact, it was probably 2 inches thick and had a lot of documentation in it. But when the media had to grab it on Friday, and the board of directors for OWASA and for UNC hospitals and for UNC Chapel Hill, basically what they had to do was they had to go back and ask the other consultant to write a layman's version of the document. I called the media person when she called me, the reporter, the primary reporter, the next day, and I said, do you need any more information from me? And she laughed and said, no, I basically wrote the article from your very brief report. And I've got everything I need from you. And if anybody says anything, then it'll be over. And it was. And so, again, I like to lead off this with an example of how you take something very technical, very analytical, very much people under pressure, and you keep the communication simple, and it sells right through. So now back to, as I go through and talk about these things, I'll kind of go in order from the workshop and give you a few slides from maybe each section. I may talk about the workshops or the book, but we start off with definition. And the one thing we learn about decision making, and most of us on the call know too and appreciate, is if we don't have clear definition, we can't make good decisions. If we're talking about two different things. And so I've given you 3 definitions here, one for reliability, one for risk, and one for resiliency. And the thing that I tell people is always have an anchor to reference those two. So there's a lot of definitions of risk, for example, but find the one that you like, find your elevator speech, and be very clear with, this is what I mean by risk. I often get asked, well, do you tell people up front what you mean by risk? And my answer is absolutely. When I go before a board or a set of decision makers, I say, when I talk about risk, I'm talking about this. It can be an uncertainty on objectives. It could be the threat of a loss. It could be consequence times likelihood expressed that way. But I'm very clear, because people's definition of risk and resiliency, by the way, although it's not about resiliency, is very subjective. So start with that definition. The other thing that confuses people, and again, we're quality and reliability professionals on the call for the most part, is that people don't understand probabilities, and that we like to throw things around in percentage terms. But this is the one I like, the classic understanding weather forecasts. And I ask my audiences, which answer is it? A, B, C, or D? And so as everybody writes their answer down, give you a second to read it and think about it. I will tell you that the only place this answer is usually unanimously right, almost unanimously too, maybe not fully unanimous, is at Palisade at-risk conferences, Monte Carlo simulations. Those folks get it right, because that's what we do. We do simulations. But about all other audiences, about 1/3 of the people say A, another third say B, another third say C, and there's maybe less than 10% that'll say D in any audience. The correct answer is C. That is what's meant. Now, the point I make out of this slide is this, that if you start throwing percentage around, there's a 3% chance of something, you've already lost 2/3 of your audience off the bat. Because in my experience, most people don't understand this, and so you've already went over people's heads. I also say, from people that I do a lot of work with asset management, and I can ask this question in these 2 ways. My daughter's also a 30-year law student, and they teach lawyers how to ask this question to get 2 different answers. The point is, this question means the same thing. But if I ask what the likelihood or chance of failure is, A, that answer is almost going to be higher than the answer in B. So I can play with perception of risk just by asking a percentage question in different ways. So the other lesson learned out of this is what's the best practice? And the best practice here is to show both frequency and percentages if you want to show a percentage. But 87 out of 234 cases gives me insight into what 37.2 means. It also gives me a little feel about confidence interval, because we all know statistics and large numbers, you know, out of 300 cases versus 3 cases, that makes me feel a little bit more confident, even though that's not technically statistically accurate necessarily. But that's the point, is I feel confident when I know the percentage is over a certain percent of cases. Going to chapter 2 a little bit more, we talk about what's decision, risk and planning and decisions. And we've probably spent at this point in a workshop probably 30 minutes working with the audience, 45 minutes on people's definition of risk and how do we apply it to different problems. Here's where we want to talk about what decisions are. And I want to start at the bottom, just read the bottom one. I ask people a lot of times, what's a decision? People can't really tell me. The best definition that I use is it's an irreversible choice among alternative ways to allocate resources. So the punchline there is, if you're not allocating resources, time or money, you're not making decisions. You may tell somebody, I want you to look into this or spend some time doing this, but until you tell them to spend a certain amount of their day, or you invest $100,000, for example, you've really got an intended course of action. It's when you allocate the resources that you have the decision. Think about that if you went to a ball game this weekend. If you say we're going to a ball game, you've got an intended course of action. When you buy the tickets, you've made the decision, now you're now going because you've committed to action. The part A of this, the upper part of the slide, is really intended to talk about 2 types of decisions. The first type is kind of the tactical, intuitive, what behavioral psychologists call system 1. That's when I see a tiger, I run. He might be a toothless tiger, he may be a chained tiger, but when I see a tiger, I run. That may not be logical, but that's how I survive. There's Albie. My son went to Auburn, so there's Albie. And the first thing I do at Albie when I see him is I give him a high five. Albie could be a terrorist in there, meaning me harm. But the reaction part of what I do, most of the people on the plant floor are going to be thinking tactically, right? Most of the people in the executive suite are going to be thinking about strategic decisions. And so the point being here is you need the communication strategy around which way the people are thinking. If I think my boss or my board is thinking of this thing in a very strategic way and I give them a short, non-quantitative answer, like it's an operational decision, they'll fire me. And then if they ask me if they think it's a simple question and I answer it in a very long way and take a long amount of time, they'll probably fire me for that. So I've got to be grounded when I talk about communicating risk to decision makers about how people really view those kinds of types of decisions. The importance of communication in the risk model, and this is from ISO 31000. Usually have that on the slide, I don't here, but this is from ISO 31000, and that's the international risk standard. Most of us as technical professionals spend our time in the risk assessment box, and that's the gray box in the middle. But what you do see from the ISO 31000 is that communication touches all steps of the risk management framework. Now the shame of that, and again back to the basics of this book, for those who have a copy of ISO 31000, it's a fairly thick, meaty document, but although they say communication touches each part of the risk framework, they dedicated 1 column of a 2-column page, and that's all. So there's no guidance for practitioners in the manual. They go into a lot more other details about risk assessments, but not about communication. Can't leave out ethics, because ethics is where we're all sitting in kind of the crosshairs of what we do. And this is what I called my whole semester's worth of ethics in 1 slide. 3 types of ethics. There's virtue ethics, which is the old Socrates and Aristotle. It talks about absolutes. And in communication, that's the equivalent of saying somebody's right, I'm right, and you're wrong. And that may work well in philosophy and religion. You can see those 2 examples there, one from Aristotle himself, virtue and vice, or the Apostle Paul, what's good and bad. It doesn't work too well in C-suites when you're trying to get decision makers to make decisions. You don't want to say I'm right and you're wrong. So we can all have parts of each of these triangles, but in your ethics, virtue is probably not the best way to communicate risk to people. The other part, and I used Obamacare for this, it could call it Trump care now, it's not meant to be political, but it's consequentialism. And that's basically says that if the harm ain't so bad, it's okay. The ends justify the means, right? And you see a lot of that happening. Quite frankly, attorneys say that. If it didn't hurt so bad, then don't punish my client, right? That's kind of how attorneys think. The third piece is deontological, and that's really where engineers come from and licensed medical professionals like physicians. It basically says that treat others as you would have treated unto you, the golden rule. And so in risk communication, that's really where we come down to what we want to talk about. And this is from my colleague, and actually he was a senior reviewer in the book, Dan Valero from Duke University. He went to every religion, and he said this is kind of a normative behavior as we treat others how we want to be treated. And so the theory here is your ethics is you may come to a bad decision, a bad allocation of resources, it may have a bad result. Still may be a good decision, but a bad result. But as long as you're telling people the technical information as you go along, and you're open and honest in your communication, then you may still have a bad result, but you've done your duty. And that's our ethics that we really think about when we talk about risk is let the buyer beware, tell everybody everything you know, which is exactly what engineers and physicians have to do. So I mentioned that because ethics is a big piece of this. And what I know from working with a lot of folks in especially manufacturing situations and engineering situations, sometimes your boss doesn't want to hear all that, but it's your obligation to tell them and figure out a way to tell them in a way that you don't get fired or you upset the apple cart. I'll move on for a minute about graphics. We spend about an hour, about a chapter here and maybe an hour in the workshop on just what kind of graphics do you want to use. Edward Tufte, some of you guys have been to his workshops and webinars or read his books. There's other sources, and I reference those in my material, but I like Tufte, and I like to follow this with the ethics piece, just to follow the ethics piece, because what he'll say is it is a matter of substance, statistics, and design, but it's also about telling the truth about the data. And all that graphics really are is a concise way to convey a lot of data. So you don't always need graphics if you don't have a lot of data, but if you've got a lot of data and you want to get a few messages across, that's where you use graphics. And then again from Tufte, I just give you these, again, the honesty and the ethics about must not quote the data out of context to your decision makers. The other things that I tell people is when you're talking about system 2 type thinking and problems, those kind of things aren't going to be solved in one meeting or one show. They're going to be passed through a couple different audiences and gates. And what you try to bend in one audience will burn you in the next one. So be honest and consistent in your graphics all the way through the show. So a few graphics that I give you, and again, you guys are going to have these slides after the fact, but these are the 6 that are kind of my go-tos. Keep them simple and concise. Pictures, geospatial, time series, tables, tornado diagrams, and guiding graphics. I won't have time today to go through all of those, but I'll touch on a few. The big piece of that is these are the ones that you kind of need, at least one of these probably in just about every communication you have if you have a lot of data. Pictures, I like my thermographic camera. I love my thermography because it tells a story. If you remember the OWASA slide earlier, you saw people in the pictures, right? It's 2 things that I talk about a lot is decision makers want to know how things affect people. So show the people in your graphics, but also if you don't have people, I like to use this from a technical sense because it also tells a story. The thermography can show heat differentials, it can show fluid levels, but there's a story to be told to make it feel real. And as interesting as it is, I'm never shocked by the way that a lot of senior executives have never seen the equipment before. And so sometimes this is a nice way to ease into that, of showing them something special about their equipment. Geospatial, again, most of us are trained in process diagrams and squiggly lines and those kind of things. Most decision makers are not. So you always want to show something with the geospatial aspect so people can relate where and how this affects things. The other thing I'll show about your graphics, as you can see my circles here that I put on that are kind of bolded, but if you look at the background data, it's what? It's very beige and bland, isn't it? And so look at what works kind of out in the real world, if you look at Google Maps or some other things, you'll see them have a very soft base and then highlight the things that really matter. Tornado diagrams, I love tornado diagrams. Some people use them and don't. I use Palisade Decision Tools Suite. But basically, in a nutshell, what this shows is with any variable, the variables, or in this case, a part of a water treatment system, are on the left side, different aspects. The center black bar that's vertical shows you a 30-year renewal and replacement cost, a base case. And then those bars show you how much it affects the base case, the maximum range, like a sensitivity analysis. And so what do I know here is things at the top matter a lot more than things at the bottom. And so when I go to my boards and my decision makers, they'll want to oftentimes now ask me, they go, JD, is this the top of the tornado diagram or the bottom? And if I say the top, they want to listen to me and really digest it. And if it's the bottom, they say, let's make a quick decision and move on. So a very powerful tool for helping gauge where you're at. Histograms are things that we lose. This is time series, but these are histograms. I like to tell people, don't try to explain histograms to decision makers. I know I'm with a bunch of technical people. It is a very hard thing to do, including cone diagrams. The lesson I want to give to you here is show more than one on the page and use the comparative analysis to help people make decisions. This was an economic development project, and you can see 3 scenarios. The break-even line, I can automatically see that option 2 was bad. Nobody wants anything to do with that. I look at 1 and 3, they look pretty good. If you look at their median line, which is the yellow line, they both make about the same amount of money. But guess what? Option 1 has more variability than option 3. So which one can the decision maker see quickly wants? 3, almost off the bat, less variability, right? About the same return for less variability. And so I don't have to try to explain what's behind the statistics and the numbers and the projections. We can just quickly get to scenario 3. Box and whisker diagrams, again, this audience is very familiar with these. I use box and whiskers when I've got a more technical group of decision makers. I like to use the cone diagrams when I'm tackling a little bit more softer set of people. People say, JD, you do a lot of probabilistic analysis. People don't understand it, and I correct them and say, if I look over on weather forecast, tornado forecast, that's Hurricane Matthew. Yeah, people understand it. We talk about hot spots and how things vary with time. And so I do show a lot of the cone diagrams from a probabilistic standpoint, and I put my little Carolina hurricane in the middle to show how no decision's a point estimate, right? Anything has a range on it. And so it kind of simulates how a storm would track. So just a cutesy way to show that. And finally, my guiding graphic for complex problems that you may be solving that take time or a series of steps. It's very important for you to come out and have some kind of guiding graphic to let decision makers know what stage of the process we're at. This is where we're at. This is what we did last time. This is where we're going after we make this decision. And so this is just one way that we kind of showed it for a climate change project on the left for adaptive management to learn as you go. And then, of course, my little guy on the right, he's some of my cartoon illustrations out of the book that I use to kind of soften up some of the technical content here. But again, the same point, let people know where you're at in the decision process. Change tunes just a little bit and talk now about the audience. Okay, we're going to move to noise now. And if you've paid attention, I'm not talked about the audience yet. People say, oh my God, in communication, you got to talk about the audience first. And I'll tell you that that's true for marketing and for sales and things like that. But for technical presentation, risk and reliability information, you want a different form of communication, which is focus on the data. Let the data tell the story. You be the messenger, bringing in the data, the information. Not that you're trying to sell a product. You're not trying to sell your decision maker. You're trying to give him information so that he or she can make that decision. 3 forms of communication here. One is on the left, you see the brown box, perceptual. That's really where the general public and the lay people in the general population are. Touch, feel, sound. How does it affect me? How does it affect my immediate family? That's typically how they think. The middle tree there shows how attorneys and policymakers think. They think very analytically, very logically, but they're also very descriptive. On the other side, you've got the engineers and the technical people like on this call. Here's where the noise comes in. If I use too many squiggly lines and too many graphs, I've already turned off the other two audiences. Okay, and if the lawyers just come into me as an engineer and we'll talk about concepts, they've turned me off. And so one of the things we have to talk about in forms of communication is kind of knowing where you are with which audience. Again, this is secondary, but it's very helpful that you don't overload your audience and create noise that detracts from your message in the way you present it. The other thing I add in this conversation is that once something bad happens, once distress happens, just about everybody abandons logic and goes over to how things touch, feel, and sound. And so when you go into crisis situations, just remember that all bets are off and you've got to now appeal to people's sensories first and then appeal to their logic. So in the book, I really talk about, in the workshops, we go into this in a lot of detail, and we spend a lot of time working with actual problems that people bring to the workshops about the different kinds of noise. And we talk a lot about the different kinds of noise that'll happen. I'm not going to go into too much detail there, other than number 2 is, again, trying to distinguish between the different types of communication. And what we're really talking about with reliability and risk is kind of that team communication and decision maker. Very important message, one of the important in the whole thing, is that the message is on, the burden is on the sender, not the receiver. I can't tell you how many times I'm told by people the board is just stupid, they'll never understand. And the truth of the matter is we're presenting to them, they're not presenting to us. So they must be smarter than us somehow because we work for them. So the burden has to be, just like signal to noise ratio in communication, it's the object of the sender to make that signal as clear as possible to the receivers. The other thing I'll say is kind of in that same thought, you know, I'm chairman of the Environmental Management Commission. For almost 30 years, people thought I was pretty smart about environmental things until I got on the board. And then I joke around and say, then I became an idiot. Somehow I forgot everything I knew, because the petitioners now think the board never understands. The boards do understand. They're business people, they're technical people too, just like we are, and most of them do understand. I talk a lot about now, as I move into this next phase, again, secondarily, but if you make your communications concise, you do have to understand individual personalities. And I talk about 4 different types, and most of you guys have been through DISC method or Myers-Briggs or something like that before. I also do handwriting analysis and neuro-linguistic programming. I'll talk about in the workshops and in my documents, my book. But all this is really to understand how people think and react. And just for simple terms today, just a reminder, percentages of audiences. This is from Marston's original work in the DISC method to talk about, you know, again, if you're going to have a little bit more information, appeal to certain personality styles first versus other types of information. And again, clear message, don't change the data, don't change the information, but the way you may deliver it may have to be a little different depending on your audience. If you're pure drivers, there's not many pure drivers, but if you try to make the decision for the driver, he's going to shut you down. Okay, so with most of my communication, I tell people you can have a preferred alternative, but you always want to give an alternative in your set of alternatives in your presentation, because some people are going to want to make their own decision, and you're usually much safer there. You're not the decision maker. And then this is kind of under stress. I'll just leave this with you. I'm not going to go through all of these right now, but it talks about how you identify these personalities under the DISC method. Switching gears to another section we talk about, I like to talk about, is groups, because in complex decisions, people seldom make that decision alone. We can say there's one decision maker. You can say that's the CEO, right? The COO, whoever makes the allocation of resources. But what we know is under uncertainty and under complexity, people bring groups in to reinforce them. We're human beings. And so part of your thing in communicating risk and reliability is to understand that's how it's going to have to get through certain gates. That's just the nature. So just knowing the ultimate decision maker's personality may not be as effective as trying to understand the whole group personality and how that decision maker uses the group. And so this is from Shoemaker, who I talk about a lot in my notes and other things as well. But one of the things that we all see in this and this is from Simon that I like to reference, is loyalty. It's one of the group behaviors. There's several group behaviors that can kill good decision making, but loyalty is one of them. And as Simon would say, loyalty is not a bad thing. That's how the organization persists and moves forward, right? We circle the wagons, and these external forces that hit us and these curveballs, we weather through, we plow through. But the also thing is, if you're the person bringing information to somebody that's new and different, especially things involving risk, it's real easy to be shot as the messenger. And so you have to be very cognizant of the fact that loyalty is both a good and a bad thing. And loyalty, a lot of times, is why people can't change and people don't hear what they want to hear. I'll also caution you here is you need to find agents sometimes too for these complex decisions. Sometimes you're not the best person individually just to go present this. There may be people here in this loyalty circle that would be a better messenger of your information. So don't be too proud to back off a little bit in your presentation and let somebody else make that presentation for you, because it's all about getting to the good decision. Talk about credibility. I think I've talked about all this, except the third one. I've really not talked about the third one in much detail, but this is kind of like, I'd say, knowing to shut up. Most of the time, technical professionals, and I have been guilty of that early in my career, is I've done all this work. Go back to the WASA example. I've done all this work. I've plowed through it. I'm proud of it. I want to talk about my model. I want to talk about all the work I did. And the truth of the matter is, most decision makers, 90% of them, 9 out of 10, don't care. They want to know the information and move on. And so what you need to do is make the presentation, be ready for questions, answer the questions, and then when they quit asking questions, it's time to leave. And that's even hard for me. I've got a lot of executives that really probably listen to me maybe more than they should as part of their inner circle of their decision maker. But when I go in as a consultant with the message, I will present my information and then dismiss myself. If they ask me to stay, that's fine, but I don't need to present and then stay in the room. I may not be in the inner circle. So knowing when to shut up and when to leave is very important in this communication idea. As I come to a close, I want to give you I like to use a business case evaluation format. There's a lot of formats for this, but it goes back to where I started. Kind of start with a conclusion, provide a little bit of background, make sure you have a good problem statement, and then in, again, 2 to 4 pages preferably, even your most complex problems, no more than 6. Keep it brief and concise, follow this format, and you'll usually have success. Handling audience questions, just a little bit, that's the written part. Here's the verbal part, and I like to work on this a lot with people. But a few things, I always repeat the question, especially in technical environments, repeat it. Once you start answering a technical question, one of the best things you can do is break away from the person that asked it with the eye contact. You want to look at the person, but if you have to go into a little bit of an explanation, you don't want it to become a personal contest between you and that board member, or you and that decision maker. So if they're on a board, especially on the board, make sure you're appealing to all the group with the question. Again, be brief, keep it simple, stay on message, and then at the end, verify you've answered the question. Always verify, have I caught what you meant, have I caught what you asked, and then move on from there. So I've given you 8 key points. I'm not going to read them to you because you'll have the handouts. But really, some of the key points, that first one, burden, is on the sender, not the receiver. It's your burden to do it. Most decision makers have different definitions of reliability and risk and other topics, so you need to clarify that. Don't overuse your graphics, use them appropriately. Different ways of reaching people. You get one shot at being trustworthy, so don't blow that. And all technical communication to be effective, you need to be honest. Concise, precise, honest, all those words that apply for technical communication, which is different than selling cars or chemicals or other things sometimes. Your job is to be the messenger in what you do. So with that, I'll close it out. If you want more information, I've got a website, reliabilityriskresiliency.com, and you can see some other information and some articles there on the topic. Again, I've mentioned the book. The website also has where I'll be doing 4 and 8 hour workshops as well. And so some of these are ASQ events, so you can come to those as well if you like to. or email me. So with that, I will wrap up, hopefully, for a few minutes of questions. So Norval?
Okay, thank you, JD. If anybody has any questions for JD, please use the chat box. We really appreciate your taking time today, JD, to present for us. We'll wait here just a moment as we're doing so. I'm going to remind everybody that we will be sending an electronic survey after today's event to get your feedback, as well as the link to the recording of the webinar. It'll be a YouTube link, and then we'll also have a PDF copy of JD's slide deck to share with you as well. So looking here, looks like one comment thanking you, JD, for presenting the information. It was really great. Another one, thank you, very interesting. I'm going to check out your book as well as Tufts.
Very good. And if anybody has any other follow-up questions, feel free to email me. I think my email is there on the screen, and I'll be glad to answer anything or help you with any part I can with this. Again, this is a topic that I've just really found to be a gap in practitioner material, especially for technical professionals. And you know, my mission here is not what I do for a living. It's just the mission of what I'm trying to do to help people communicate a little bit better, just like me, with trying to get our technical communication to be a little bit sharper and concise and effective with decision makers. So I appreciate the time and you guys listening to me today.
Thanks, JD. One last reminder, we're going to take a little bit of a break from webinars. The next one will be in 3 weeks. It'll be tips and tricks for selling quality by David Muncaster of Staples Advantage Canada. That will be on Tuesday, August 15th, noon to 1 Eastern time. If nobody has any other questions, and it looks like nobody does, I guess we'll call it for now. We'd like to thank you once again, JD, and also thank those of you who tuned in today. We appreciate your supporting us. And with that being said, I'd like to wish everybody a good rest of the day. Thanks very much. Bye now.